The heavy velvet curtains of the ballroom were supposed to be the backdrop for my triumph, not my public execution. When my former boss Marcus stepped onto the stage and took the microphone to honor my 10-year tenure, I expected a gold watch or perhaps a polite toast to my dedication. Instead, he announced that I had been fired 3 months ago for embezzlement, while my husband stood in the front row, whispering into the ear of the very woman I had once trusted as my closest mentor. The room, packed with industry giants and local elite, fell into a suffocating, unnatural silence that felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. As I stood there in my best silk gown, a cocktail glass trembling in my hand, I watched my husband David slip a diamond-encrusted bracelet onto that woman's wrist. The same bracelet he had told me was lost in a burglary during our move last winter. Only a year ago, my life felt like a perfectly curated photograph. Every morning began with the precise scent of freshly ground Arabica beans and the soft, golden light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse David and I had purchased together. I was the chief operating officer of a firm that had grown under my guidance from a struggling startup into a titan of the market. My life was defined by the mahogany desk where I spent 12-hour days, the smell of expensive printer toner, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that my partnership with Marcus was built on a foundation of mutual ambition and long nights of shared problem-solving. David was my anchor. He was a high-end architect who spent his days sketching glass and steel futures, and he was the one who insisted on the elaborate parties, the expensive vacations to the coast, and the high society circles that made my career trajectory feel complete. We were the golden couple. Everyone said so. When I looked at the photos from our anniversary gala the year prior, I saw two people who looked like they owned the world. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, was always on the periphery of our lives. She was a woman who moved through rooms like a silent, well-tailored predator. I remembered her sharp, probing questions during our Sunday dinners, her eyes scanning our living room as if calculating the resale value of our antique furniture. At the time, I viewed her as a harmless, if somewhat intrusive, relic of a bygone era. She would fuss over the dust on the baseboards or remark on how expensive our lifestyle was, and I would simply laugh it off, secure in the knowledge that our joint accounts were overflowing. I was the breadwinner, the one whose salary paid the mortgage on the sprawling property we held in a trust, and I had foolishly assumed that the professional success I built was the bedrock of my marriage. I believed that my commitment to the firm, which demanded so much of my time and emotional energy, was the glue that kept David happy. I ignored the small signs, the way he would grow quiet whenever I mentioned the firm's auditing process, or the way Marcus would suddenly change the subject if I brought up the idea of taking a sabbatical to actually enjoy the life we had built. I remember one specific Tuesday in November. I had come home early to surprise David with tickets to the opera, only to find the house smelling of a strange, floral perfume that certainly wasn't mine. I found him in the study, his laptop slammed shut the moment I entered. He looked at me with a panicked, hollow expression that he quickly masked with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Just work, darling," he had muttered, turning back to his sketches. "The firm is under a lot of pressure, and I'm just trying to keep us afloat." I hadn't pushed him. I had walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of wine, and told myself that I was being paranoid, that the pressure of maintaining a high net worth status was simply getting to us both. The penthouse felt like a sanctuary, a quiet bubble of success. But looking back now, the cracks were everywhere. The accounts were becoming increasingly complex, with Marcus insisting on offshore optimizations that I signed off on without a second glance because I trusted him with my life. My own salary was being diverted into a secondary holding account to protect it from market volatility, a scheme David had convinced me was standard practice for people in our tax bracket. Every luxury item we acquired, every piece of art that adorned our walls, felt like a symbol of our unity, never realizing they were merely temporary placeholders until the house of cards began to wobble. The air in our home, once crisp and filled with the promise of a future, was becoming stagnant with secrets. I was too busy climbing the ladder to notice that someone had been quietly unscrewing the base from the ground. The first hairline fracture appeared during a board meeting in mid-February, when the quarterly audit report came back with a series of vague, unexplainable discrepancies. When I confronted Marcus in his office, his response was disturbingly calm. He leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking rhythmically, and told me that the internal restructuring I had authorized was too complex for me to track manually. I felt a fleeting prickle of unease. I had never authorized any restructuring, but he quickly slid a stack of files across the mahogany surface, his eyes locking onto mine with a synthetic, reassuring warmth. "Don't stress yourself, Elena. You've been working yourself into the ground. Let me handle the paperwork. That's what partners are for." The signs became more frequent, like a rhythmic tapping against a glass wall. My credit card was declined at a boutique in the city, the shop assistant offering an apologetic, pitying look that made my skin crawl. When I checked our joint online banking app, it glitched, showing a balance of 0 before redirecting to an error page. David brushed it off later that evening with a casual laugh, claiming it was a bank-wide cybersecurity update and that he had moved our assets into a secure private hedge to maximize yield while the markets were fluctuating. "It's all part of the 5-year plan, honey," he said, pouring me a glass of scotch that felt heavy and bitter on my tongue. "By the end of the year, we'll be doubling our net worth. You're just overthinking because you're tired." His mother, Eleanor, began showing up at the penthouse unannounced, her visits coinciding with David's long, unexplained absences. She would spend hours walking through the rooms, dragging her gloved fingers along the crown molding, her thin lips pursed in what I interpreted as judgmental scrutiny. "It's a lovely house, Elena," she remarked one afternoon, sipping tea that she had brewed herself. "But it's a shame when assets become stagnant. David tells me you've been looking into liquidating some of the larger holdings. Very smart. Real estate is so unpredictable these days." I had never mentioned liquidating anything, and the way her eyes darted toward my jewelry box before settling back on me sent a shiver down my spine that I couldn't explain away. The point of no return arrived on a rain-slicked Tuesday. I had returned to the office after hours to retrieve a flash drive I'd forgotten for a client presentation. The building was a hollow, echoing shell. As I passed Marcus's office, the glow of his monitor spilled into the hallway, and I heard the unmistakable, soft laughter of a woman. It wasn't the laughter of an assistant. It was intimate, melodic, and chillingly familiar. I crept closer, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, until the voices grew distinct. It was the firm's chief legal counsel, a woman I had considered a mentor for years. "Everything is in place," Marcus was saying, his voice low and vibrating with excitement. "Elena will be completely wiped out by the time the anniversary gala rolls around. David's already transferred the deeds to the secondary shell company. We framed her for the embezzlement. Once she's disgraced, no one will believe a word she says about the accounts." My knees buckled. I reached out to steady myself against the wall, but my hand hit a heavy brass planter, sending it crashing to the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent office. The laughter inside ceased instantly. I didn't wait to see them emerge. I turned and ran, my breath coming in jagged, desperate gasps. I drove home in a blur of gray rain and neon lights, my mind reeling, the physical sensation of blood draining from my face, leaving me lightheaded and shivering. I fumbled with my keys, stumbling into the study, and scrambled toward the floor safe hidden behind a painting. I hadn't opened it in months. I punched in the code, my fingers shaking so violently that I mistyped it twice. When the door finally clicked open, the safe was empty. My heart skipped, then hammered so hard I thought I might lose consciousness. I pulled out the secondary internal logbook I'd kept hidden at the bottom, flipping through the pages in a panic. The final 20 pages had been neatly sliced out with a razor blade. Beneath them, tucked into a velvet-lined compartment, was a single, folded sheet of paper, an offshore account statement in David's and Eleanor's names, showing millions of dollars transferred from our joint corporate account over the last 6 months. The air in the room suddenly felt devoid of oxygen. I sank to the floor, the cold hardwood biting into my skin as the world slowed to a crawl. My stomach churned, a wave of nausea so potent I could taste copper in my mouth. I wasn't just losing my money, my home, or my reputation. I was looking at the calculated, systematic erasure of my entire existence. David hadn't been managing my assets. He had been harvesting them, with his mother acting as the architect of my demise. The silence in the room was absolute, yet the roar in my ears was deafening. I was standing in the ruins of my life, and for the first time, I realized that the trap hadn't been set by some random misfortune. It had been built by the man who kissed me goodnight every single night for 10 years. The realization hit me not like a sudden shock, but like the slow, agonizing spread of a toxin. I sat on the floor of the study for what felt like hours, the silence of the house pressing against my eardrums. My reflection in the darkened glass of the sliding balcony door looked like a stranger, pale, hollow-eyed, and utterly shattered. But as the clock on the mantel chimed midnight, a strange, frigid clarity began to replace the nausea. The tears didn't come. Instead, a cold, sharp-edged rage began to solidify in my chest, replacing the frantic panic of the past hour. I heard the front door click. My muscles coiled. David was home. I didn't move as he walked into the foyer, whistling a soft, jaunty tune, the sound of a man who thought he had won. He stopped when he saw me sitting on the floor in the dark. He didn't look worried. He looked annoyed. "Elena, why are you sitting in the dark like a ghost? You're scaring me," he said, flicking the light switch. The sudden glare blinded me, but I didn't look away. I watched his face as he took in the open safe, the empty compartments, and the single statement paper resting on my lap. His expression didn't shift to guilt. It shifted to cold, surgical calculation. "You weren't supposed to be home for another 3 hours," he said, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. It was flat, transactional. "I found the statement, David," I whispered, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. "And I know about the logs. I know about Marcus. I know you've been bleeding the firm dry and pinning it on me for the audit reports." He walked toward me, his silhouette looming large, and for a second, I felt a flicker of the old fear. He sat on the edge of the ottoman, leaning in close enough that I could smell the expensive scotch he'd been drinking. "Elena, darling, you have such a dramatic imagination. Those papers are drafts, projections. You're overtired, and clearly you've let your professional stress bleed into your personal life." "Don't," I snapped, pulling back. I heard you and Marcus talking about the embezzlement charges. I know you sold the house, David. The papers are already being processed, aren't they?" He let out a short, jagged laugh. "You're a brilliant woman, Elena, but you're so incredibly naive. You think you built this company? You built the spreadsheets, sure, but the vision? The connections? The legal maneuvering? That was Marcus and me. You were the golden goose that kept the investors happy with your integrity. But geese get cooked, Elena. That's just the natural order of business." "And your mother?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Was she in on this from the start? Was the lost jewelry, the mortgage refinancing, all of it just a setup? "My mother is a realist," he sneered, finally dropping the pretense. "She saw you as a liability a long time ago. We needed this capital for the new project in Singapore, and honestly, you weren't going to give it up. You were too obsessed with your precious legacy. So, we made a choice." He stood up and began pacing the room, his arrogance radiating off him like heat. "You're going to resign tomorrow morning, cite health issues, and sign the transfer documents for the remaining assets. If you don't, well, the authorities will find a very compelling paper trail leading directly to your unauthorized offshore accounts. You'll be lucky if you walk away with nothing but a prison sentence." Just then, the study door creaked open. Eleanor stood there, draped in a silk robe, her face a mask of cold, grandmotherly concern. She didn't look at me. She walked straight to the cabinet, poured herself a drink, and spoke without turning around. "David, stop wasting time with the theatrics. The lawyer is arriving at 8 tomorrow morning. If she doesn't sign, we have the police report ready to file. She's already been flagged by the firm's security team as a security risk. She hasn't been an employee here for 3 months, Elena. Did you really think no one would notice you accessing the servers tonight?" I looked at her, then back at David. This was the second twist. I wasn't just losing my money. I had already been legally locked out of my own life while I was still working. The firm I thought I was running had been a prison for weeks. 3 months? I asked, my throat tightening. "I've been coming into the office every day. I've been holding meetings." "You've been holding meetings with decoys, sweetheart," David chuckled. "The real accounts were moved in January. You were just maintaining the illusion so we could finish the liquidation without you causing a scene." I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. I felt a surge of pure, icy venom. I looked at the man I had loved for a decade and realized he was a hollow shell, a parasite who had spent 10 years wearing the skin of a human being. I walked past him toward the door, my heart pounding a rhythm of war. "Where are you going?" David called out, his voice tinged with a hint of genuine uncertainty. I stopped at the doorway and turned back. "I'm going to finish the anniversary gala speech, David, but not the one you wrote for me. I'm going to tell everyone exactly who you are." Eleanor laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "You have no proof, and no one will believe a disgraced employee. You're nothing, Elena." I looked at them, both of them, my husband and his mother, standing in the room I had paid for, in the clothes I had bought, feeding on the life I had created. "That's where you're wrong, Eleanor. You forgot one thing. I'm not just the COO. I'm the person who wrote the security protocols for the entire firm. I didn't just access the server tonight. I downloaded the keys to your kingdoms." I turned and walked out, my pulse slowing, my mind already weaving the web that would destroy them both. The war had just begun. The city lights looked like cold, glittering diamonds as I drove away from the penthouse. My hands were steady on the wheel, the initial shock replaced by a calculated, lethal precision. I didn't go to the police, not yet. I knew that Marcus, David, and Eleanor had already seeded the soil with false narratives, and a panicked report from a disgraced employee would be dismissed as the rantings of a scorned woman. Instead, I drove to a nondescript office building in the industrial district where an old friend of mine, Julian, a man who worked in private cyber forensics and owed me a favor from a decade ago, kept his late-night operations running. I spent the next 6 hours in his dim, monitor-lit office, the hum of servers providing a hypnotic backdrop to the dismantling of my own life. As I fed the data from the flash drive I'd pulled from the server into a system, the full extent of the betrayal crystallized. It wasn't just embezzlement, it was a long-term shell game. They had been laundering money for a private equity firm that was currently under federal investigation for massive fraud. David wasn't just stealing, he was leaving me as the primary signatory on every illicit transaction. "Elena," Julian said, his voice grave as he squinted at a cascade of encrypted lines. "If you take this to the SEC, you're not just blowing the whistle, you're nuking the entire firm. And because your digital signature is on the final approvals, you're going to be in the blast zone too. They've framed you perfectly." "I know," I replied, staring at a screen that showed a wire transfer of $5 million to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, an account linked to Eleanor's maiden name. "But look at the timestamp on the approval. It was authorized at 3:14 a.m. on a Sunday. I was logged into my hospital's portal as a volunteer that morning, 6 states away. I have the digital footprint of my location, the transit logs, and the patient records. They weren't just careless, Julian, they were arrogant. They thought because I trusted them, I'd never check the metadata. By dawn, I had enough evidence to burn their world to the ground. But I needed a grand stage, and the anniversary gala was only hours away. I arrived at the gala just as the ballroom was reaching its crescendo of champagne and networking. I didn't hide in the back. I walked right up to the stage, wearing an elegant, razor-sharp white suit that stood out against the sea of black-tie evening wear. The room went deathly silent. David, standing at the bar with Eleanor and Marcus, went pale as a sheet. His cocktail glass slid from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor. Marcus was the first to move, rushing toward me with a desperate, pasted-on smile, his eyes darting toward the heavy security guards near the exits. "Elena, you aren't supposed to be here. You're having a breakdown. Let's get you to your car." He reached for my arm, his grip bruising, but I stepped back, my voice projecting across the ballroom floor. "Marcus, take your hands off me, or I'll ensure that the security you're gesturing to is the first to see the unredacted audit reports I've just finished uploading to the company's public server." The room collectively held its breath. A few guests reached for their phones, their curiosity piquing. "Don't listen to her," David shouted, his voice cracking, losing its carefully crafted composure. "She's unstable! She was fired for theft!" I looked him dead in the eye, feeling an intense, liberating rush of adrenaline. I pulled a small remote from my pocket, the one controlling the projector screen behind the stage. "I didn't come here to argue, David. I came to present the real fiscal year report, the one that includes the offshore accounts linked to your mother's charitable foundation. I pressed the button. Instead of the corporate growth charts the guests expected, the screen flickered to life, showing a vivid, high-resolution breakdown of the transfers, complete with audio recordings of Marcus and Eleanor planning the frame-up. The room erupted into a cacophony of whispers. The heavy hitters of the industry, the people who had invested millions based on the firm's reputation, stared at the screen with mouths agape. Marcus lunged for the microphone, his face purple with rage, but he tripped over the stage stairs. It was pathetic. It was the end of his professional existence. "There's more," I added, my voice cutting through the rising panic. "If you look at your phones, you'll see an email from the SEC. Every attendee here has just been CC'd on the formal filing regarding the criminal enterprise operating out of this building. The police are already in the lobby. I suggest you all decide which side of the law you want to be standing on." Eleanor, who had been standing like a statue, finally broke. She rushed toward me, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. "You stupid, arrogant girl! You think you've won? You've destroyed your own career! You'll be penniless!" I stepped toward her, invading her space until she was forced to look up at me. I leaned in close, whispering just loud enough for the immediate circle to hear. "I lost my money, Eleanor, but you just lost your freedom. And frankly, I'm going to enjoy watching you learn how to live without a tailor." The police burst through the doors, their uniforms a sharp contrast to the glamorous crowd. I watched as the officers bypassed the confused guests and headed straight for the stage. Marcus and David looked like cornered animals, their eyes darting for exits that were already blocked. My transformation was complete. The victim who had been crying on the floor the night before was gone. In her place was a woman who had orchestrated the most spectacular downfall the city had seen in decades. As the handcuffs clicked shut around Marcus's wrists, I didn't feel triumph. I felt silence. The kind of silence that precedes the rebuilding of a foundation that is finally, mercifully, honest. The chaos in the ballroom was absolute, a fever dream of flashing blue lights, aggressive cameramen, and the shrill sound of Marcus screaming about his lawyers. I stood on the periphery, a silent observer of the wreckage. I watched as David was shoved into the back of a police cruiser, his designer suit rumpled, and his face twisted in a mask of impotent fury. He didn't even have the courage to look at me as they slammed the door. Eleanor, however, met my gaze through the glass of the squad car. Her defiance had evaporated, replaced by a hollow, vacant look of someone who had realized too late that she had bet her entire life on a failing hand. I didn't stay for the final arrests. I handed my tablet, containing the encrypted keys and the master logs, to the lead investigator, a woman whose stern, no-nonsense demeanor I had verified through my forensic friend earlier that morning. My work was done. I walked out of the gala, the cool night air biting at my skin, a sensation that felt more real and invigorating than anything I had experienced in years. I didn't have a home to go to, and my bank accounts remained frozen under the investigation. But for the first time in a decade, the weight in my chest was gone. The legal fallout was swift and merciless. Because I had preemptively filed the evidence with the SEC and federal authorities, I was granted whistleblower status, which protected me from the criminal charges Marcus had meticulously manufactured. The ensuing months were a blur of depositions, courtroom appearances, and the humiliating public stripping of the firm's assets. Marcus and David were sentenced to long terms in federal prison, their names permanently etched into the annals of white-collar crime. Eleanor, unable to prove her ignorance of the financial structure, lost her home and her status, relegated to a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, her carefully constructed high society life reduced to a cautionary tale. I didn't try to salvage the wreckage. I sold off the remnants of my previous life, the designer clothes, the jewelry David had gifted me, the furniture that felt like it belonged to a ghost. I used the small severance I had secured through a legal loophole to move to a quiet coastal town, thousands of miles away from the city that had tried to swallow me whole. 6 months later, I found myself sitting on the porch of a modest, sun-bleached cottage, the sound of the ocean rhythmic and steady against the cliffs. I was drinking a cup of coffee, the steam curling into the crisp morning air. I had started a small consulting firm, helping startups establish secure and transparent operating protocols. A bit of irony I found deeply satisfying. My life was simple. My kitchen table was wood, not mahogany. My windows looked out onto the horizon, not the suffocating skyline of a city that measured value in square footage. I thought about the night of the anniversary, the way I had felt as I walked onto that stage. I realized then that the woman who had walked into that ballroom wasn't a victim. She was the architect of her own liberation. I had lost the trappings of success, but I had regained my agency, a currency far more valuable than anything David or Marcus had ever touched. My phone chimed with a message from my new assistant, a notification about a scheduled meeting with a potential client. I set the phone down and looked out at the waves, their white caps glowing in the rising sun. The smell of salt and cedar replaced the sterile scent of the office. I was no longer an appendage to someone else's ambition. I was the author of my own piece. I stood up, feeling the strength in my legs, the clarity in my mind, and the absolute, unshakable truth that I had survived. As I walked back into my home, I smiled, not a polite boardroom smile, but a genuine, quiet expression of freedom. The past was a locked room, and I had finally thrown away the key. True power isn't about what you can take from the